So last month I uploaded a video to my TikTok that went a little viral with just over 14.5 million views. Since then, I've been inundated with messages from people asking for a tutorial on this 3D or parallax effect. So it's been a little time, but here it is. So essentially this effect is a series of images that are stacked up on top of each other, which we will then push back in a 3D plane later on in After Effects. So with that in mind, it is best to shoot these layers separately. So for example, in the falling newspaper image, I shot the newspaper backdrop first. I then shot the portrait of myself holding the newspaper second, and then finally I shot the falling newspaper assets last. It didn't really matter where those newspaper assets were in the frame when I shot them, because I knew that I would be cutting them out and sort of positioning them where I wanted them to be for that final image. I then took all of the images into Lightroom and applied a very simple black and white color grade to all of them. It's essential that when you are grading this, that you grade them all the same. So my tip for this would be to grade the main subject of your image first. For example, in the newspaper one, it was the portrait of myself holding the newspaper. So I graded that and then just copied and pasted the effects onto the rest of the image so that it just all looks the same, because we're going to be building them all together in Photoshop. So now that we've kind of prepped all of the images for this effect, I then exported them from Lightroom into a folder so that I could then import them into Photoshop and sort of begin creating this image. So that's where this kind of stops, and we're going to jump into that tutorial now. The first thing you're going to do is click open and select one of the images from the shoot. I am opening the shot of myself holding the newspaper first. Then drag the rest of the images from Finder into the Photoshop file. Make sure they're positioned correctly and press enter to add them in. Before I start editing, it's important to stay organized. So I've put each image or layer in order for how the 3D image will be set up, with the background which is furthest from the camera at the bottom, all the way up to the newspaper which is closest to the camera at the top. I've also labeled these to make it clear and easy to work with. Now we're ready to start cutting each of the newspaper pages out and place them where we want them in our image. We're going to do this one layer at a time, so I'm just going to hide the rest of the layers that I'm not working with at the moment. I'm just going to quickly make this layer a smart object. I do this by using the eraser tool and just clicking on the image. Using the pen tool, I'm going to make my selection around the newspaper. Once you've fully gone around it, click the button Make Selection at the top. I like to choose 1 or 2 pixels. This gives a natural softness to your edges. Now, you've currently got the newspaper selected, but you want to delete the rest of the image around it. You do this by deleting the inverse of the selection you've got. Once done, press backspace to delete. You may still have the newspaper selected, so press Command D on your Mac or Control D on Windows to deselect. And now you can move your newspaper into position. And that is the first layer done. You're essentially going to do the same thing for the rest of the layers in your image. Cropping a person out is a little more tricky, but there's a very easy selection method to use. Just go to Select and then Subject, and Photoshop will figure out what the subject in this layer is. Again, select the inverse and delete the rest of the image. This method isn't perfect, so you'll have to go around and neaten up what Photoshop missed with the eraser tool. I'm just going to finish up the rest of the layers using the same method I did for the previous newspaper layers and place them into position. A lot of the time I'd actually be finished in Photoshop here and take it all over into After Effects. However, my body should be casting a shadow on the background and the falling newspaper behind me, so I'm just going to quickly add in some shadows. So in this situation, because my body will be casting the shadow, I'm going to duplicate the layer of me, and then I'm going to name this layer Shadow 1. And then, as I did previously, I'm going to select the subject and then get the paintbrush tool and just color the full selection in black. Once you're done creating a sort of silhouette, you'll need to deselect your subject for the next step. Again, to do this, it's Command D on a Mac or Control D on a Windows. Now, because shadows don't have hard edges, we're going to add a Gaussian blur to the layer just to soften them up a bit. For this, I've chosen around 126 and press OK. I'm just going to duplicate the shadow layer for later. You'll see why in a bit, but for now, I'm just going to hide it. The first shadow will be interacting with the background, so I'm going to drag the layer above the background layer. The shadow should be casting slightly lower and to the left of the subject, as the light source is slightly higher and coming from the right. I dropped the opacity to reduce the intensity of the shadow. Once happy with the final position, right-click the shadow layer and select Merge Visible. Make sure the only layers that are visible are the background and the shadow layer. You don't want to go accidentally merging any of the other layers with this as well. Now for the next shadow. Shadow number 2 will interact with the falling newspaper behind me. So similar to what we did with the background layer, we're going to drag the shadow layer above the newspaper layer that we want it to interact with. I'm just going to switch the layer of myself on as a reference for the position of this shadow. Once you're happy with the position, make sure you only have the shadow and newspaper layer visible and merge them together. Now make an inverse selection around the newspaper. This means you can only alter things outside of your selection. I used the eraser tool to erase the overlapping shadow, and as you can see, it did not delete any of the newspaper. I'm just renaming the layers here to what they were originally, as they were changed once merging the two layers together. And now we're ready to take this into After Effects to create the 3D movement. Just click Save As and save the Photoshop file as a PSD on your hard drive. We're going to be working with this exact file in After Effects. In After Effects, minimize the first box that pops up and go to File and import your PSD Photoshop file that you were just working with. Make sure you have the options Import as Footage and Create Composition selected. Double click on your composition to open it up. You'll see that it is laid out exactly how you had it in Photoshop, with all the layers in the same format. At the moment we're dealing with a 2D image. If I press P on my keyboard, it will bring up position, with an X and a Y component. If I check this box here, it introduces a Z component. This is where the 3D aspect is introduced. So next I checked all the boxes for 3D for each of the different layers, making sure they all have a Z value I can work with. For the zoom in effect, we're going to need to add in a virtual camera. So go to Layer, New and select Camera and click OK. And you will now see that there is a new layer called Camera. It's now time to make this image 3D. Click to highlight the background layer and press P on your keyboard to bring up position. We're going to take that Z value and drag it to the right. This pushes the image away from the camera and gives you that 3D effect. Now you can play around with these values and find out what works best for you, but I've gone with a value of 2000 for my background. Now as you can see, the background no longer covers the whole image. You have that black negative space around the outsides. So what we're going to do is scale up the background to fill it. With the background layer highlighted, press S on your keyboard to bring up the scale options and scale the image up. I've gone with 146% for this one. Now with the background at the right scale, I've then pressed P to make a few more adjustments to the position of the background. And once you're happy, just press P to hide the position adjustments again. And so now you've seen how I've done the first layer, I'm going to use the same method for the rest of the layers. These numbers that I'm using are just a preference, as I've done this effect many times for different things, but experiment with them and see what works best for you and your style. Here are the position values for each of the layers. Pause here if you want to put them in. And here are the scale values. Next, we're going to create the zoom in effect using the camera. So what we're going to do is highlight the camera layer and press P. Whilst on the first frame of the sequence, press the stopwatch to add a keyframe. Next, go to your endpoint. For me, I normally like my movement to be around 16 seconds long. Then click and drag the Z value to the right to move the camera into the point you want your effect to finish. And now you have an animated movement. We're pretty much done here. All we need to do is help sell the 3D effect by adding in some blur to the background. Highlight the background layer, go to Effect, Blur, and then Gaussian Blur. Create a keyframe on your first frame and then go to your last frame and add a second keyframe with a blur value of 5. I then added some blur to the foreground falling newspaper too, using the same method. And now we're ready to export this. So I'm just going to crop my timeline to 16 seconds as that's where my movement ends. To export this, we're going to add this to the render queue. Select a location to export this to, and click render. This will probably take a few minutes. If I want to post this to Instagram or TikTok, I take this 3D video into Premiere Pro, where I crop and export it for either of the two social platforms. And there you go, that's how I created this 3D falling newspaper effect. So that is a tutorial behind the 3D newspaper falling effect that you guys saw on my TikTok. I hope that you guys have been able to follow along. I know it's slightly complicated at times, but it's definitely a very cool effect that I use commercially a lot. So if you can learn it, it'll definitely add another string to your bow. But anyway, that is it for this video. I hope you guys have enjoyed it. And yeah, hope to see you guys soon. Peace out.